Hello, Cyclithids. I am Robert Walker, author of Session Zero, the DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System. And today we're going to be tackling a bit more of an emotional topic. And what we're going to be talking about is the psychology of character death. Now, if you've been listening to the show since season one, or if you've gone back and listened to previous episodes, you'll know that this is something that we've talked about before. However, now that we're moving into a video format and being a little bit more active on socials, because this was such a popular topic and got so much traction, I wanted to revisit it and discuss it again with you in person, where you can see me talking about it sort of face to face as we were. Now, if you are not familiar, the idea for character death is not new. It's been happening in narrative for a very, very long time. But it is powerful and emotional and impactful to us because of something that is known as the willful suspension of disbelief for the moment. Now, this concept was first discussed by British author Samuel Coleridge back in 1817 about audiences for literature works. What it essentially states is that to become emotionally involved in a narrative, we must react and act as if the characters are real, the events are really happening, and even though we know it's only a story, for the moment, we accept that suspension of disbelief so that we can have an emotional experience about a narrative. So what does this mean in terms of character death? Well, it means that for a brief moment, while we suspend our disbelief, we're going to experience real emotions that occur when death happens in a game or in a narrative in a story. We're going to have moments of grief, feelings of loss. These feelings can be overwhelming. Death can elicit all number of difficult feelings: anger, sadness, resentment, regret, sometimes even a sense of relief. It can disrupt the way that you're feeling overall and make it difficult to think straight. Now, in a role-playing game or in a story, these feelings might not be as profound, as pronounced as when we experience them in real life, but we are experiencing the same sort of feelings on a micro scale. It doesn't make the feelings any less real. So when you have players engaged in a story, in a campaign, and they have accepted that as real because of willful suspension of disbelief for the moment, a pivotal event like a character death, when that takes place, the players can be caught off guard, and they have to go through a very real, although suspended disbelief moment of the grieving process. Especially if this has been a prolonged game and your characters have made in-game relationships and your players have an emotional attachment to these characters, this whole process can be very difficult. Grieving is a very individual experience, and there's no right or wrong way to do it for your characters or for your players. So you might actually see outbursts of anger around your table when a character dies, particularly if that character feels like a piece of themselves that they've been role-playing and embodying the personality of. That can be sort of like experiencing a mini death of a piece of one's personality, and it can have emotions like sadness and resentment and anger creep in and come out of character at your table. You can also have this sense of relief or guilt. There's no roadmap to the way that we process our grief and our loss, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. So you're going to have to accept that when there are big moments like a character death in your campaigns, there's no right or wrong way for your players to respond because they are experiencing these emotions through the lens that they need to. This is a real emotional experience that they're having, so let it be something that is applicable and useful for your players. As a dungeon master, you should foster experiences like this and let them be something that can be applicable to the everyday lives of your players. Give them the opportunity to use your game as a training process for dealing with real moments of grief in their life. Now, like I said, you're only going to be experiencing them on a very small scale, but individuals who play role-playing games have been shown to be more likely to have higher emotional quotients. They have a higher EQ. And part of that is because they have practiced dealing with difficult scenarios, things like death and struggles and difficulties, and learning how to work together as a team when it might be difficult, and process and understand the emotions of others and the needs of others. Even though we're practicing those on a micro scale, we're still learning how to do it in our real lives. So, what's beautiful about things like character death is they give us an opportunity to practice the grieving process, even if it won't ever come close to the actual emotions that are going to overwhelm us when a true loss or devastation or death takes place in our lives. Even having practiced the steps of that on a micro scale is going to make us better at handling those situations when they do arise in our real life. And this is one reason why I always advocate for DMs to embrace moments like character death and don't shy away from them, especially if they make sense in the narrative, if they have a good place in the story, and this is the way that the story naturally evolves. Don't shy away from them just because you're afraid of difficult emotions at your table or the momentary anger that might occur with the loss of a character life, be it player character or non-player character. These sort of things do have place in story. And if you think about the best stories that you have ever watched or read or listened, most of them somewhere along that path involve characters having to deal with grief and loss and overcoming the challenges that occur in real life. They happen to all of us. We all have to deal with these sort of things. So being better at doing so is only going to help us in the long run. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've probably heard us talk about experiences where we have had characters that at the end of the game, part of their hero's journey was having to make the sacrifice of their own life or their own sanity in order to save their people or their friends, their adventuring group. Those moments are some of the most memorable moments that we've ever had in games that we still continue to talk about and reminisce about to this day, because that is the true hero's journey, right? To be able to be willing to make the sacrifice for what it is they believe in and what it is that they stand for. Now, if you're playing an edition like D&D 5e, even say D&D 4e or Pathfinder 2nd edition, character death can be something that is really hard to come by. I've even heard other people on podcasts say that if you kill a character in D&D 5e, consider that an accomplishment because there's so many ways for that not to happen now. Now, there's obviously always ways for it to happen, and I'm not telling you to go out and kill player characters. That's not the point. What I am saying is to embrace the narrative if it makes sense and if it does fit the story. I will never forget the moment where one of our characters had sacrificed their own life and their sanity for the benefit of the rest of the party. The emotional scene that took place because of the willful suspension of disbelief for the moment, where all of the other players around the table were heavily invested in that role play moment. As I described the scene to the players and what was taking place, I remember getting to the end of that description, looking up around the table, and here are three grown men in their 30s, all with tears in their eyes, and I'm choked up as I'm telling the story because it is that emotionally heavy. It had so much grit and rawness and realness to us in that moment that every single one of us was having an emotional experience at this character's sacrifice. We were experiencing this profound loss as though it was our own, even though it was only part of a story. It's these moments that is why I believe that D&D and role-playing in general is inherently connected to our psychology. Role-playing is practicing life. I've said it many times before, and I will continue to say it. Now, we might be doing things that are grandiose, out of this world. Casting spells are not possible in our real world or in our existence, and who knows, maybe not even in our multiverse. But what we are experiencing emotionally as characters is a real response to an emotional event in a world that we've chosen to accept as real for a short time. This is the same as when we watch a movie or read a book and there's an emotional scene and we are brought to tears. This happens in games all the time when you accept them as a true narrative for that short period of time. And here's the best part. Because we are willfully suspending our disbelief for the moment, we also have the ability to resume our disbelief when the time comes. That means we get to experience these deep emotional feelings for as long as we choose, but at the end of that time, we can resume knowing that it is just a story, a narrative, and these emotions are related to fictional things. So That is so beneficial for us, and it gives you a very good concept of why you would want very emotional elements in your games like this. Think of scenes of death when either a main character themselves or someone who is close to the main character dies in a film. That death almost always adds a very important meaning to the character's journey. When I think of a time that this was done very, very well from my younger years was from the 1984 film The Neverending Story, when the hero Atreyu loses his horse Artax in the Swamps of Sadness. The horse is overcome with sadness, and the whole scene is very emotional as Artax is sinking. Atreyu is crying out, screaming to not give in to the sadness, but the horse sinks its way and loses its life in the Swamps of Sadness. And still to this day, when I watch that scene, I feel like it is very well done. It draws you in with the narrative and the action, and you can feel that emotional loss that the character's going through, and you can accept that loss as your own. You feel like you're losing Artax along with Atreyu. Now, this reminds me of a lot of powerful moments that have occurred in my campaigns. They elicit the same sort of responses when death happens in our games. If you haven't seen the film, there's a more modern representation I can think of, which is when Tony Stark dies at the end of Avengers Endgame. It's like this full coming of circle moment because he was the hero that kicked off like the modern era of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And he had this big grand farewell. They had the whole I Love You 3000 moment with his daughter. Talk about bringing up emotions that even though we know the story isn't real, but any of us who has a child or has something they care about very deeply like that gets invested in that entire bonding moment that he has. And then it makes that death even more profound when it happens. I wanted to use some movie examples here because movies do something really well, and there's exceptions to this, of course, but something that I think is very important for your campaigns in general is that after a emotional scene like a death, that there is a moment of hope, something that brings back the idea that the death was important and it served a greater purpose. So offer hope, offer purpose to your players after a moment of a character or an NPC death that is emotionally difficult. And I think this is part of that process for training or practicing for real life. We need to know that after grief, there is hope. After loss, there still is life. But I want you to take away from this that no character death is ever going to hit you as profoundly as dealing with true tragedy or true loss in your life. And I don't want to minimize the impact of the emotions that a person might have in their real life after a real tragedy or loss, but I just want to highlight the fact that I think it is important to have the opportunity to practice dealing and experiencing such emotions so that when you are going through the more profound, and that's Wednesday there, welcome to the show Wednesday, the more profound emotions, that there's always that sense of light at the end of the tunnel. So the last thing I will say on this topic before we do some tricks of the trade is that if you are struggling with emotions because of something that has happened in your life, something that you've lost, or any sort of traumatic experience that you have had, please seek help. There are resources out there, and I promise you that talking to someone does help. Maybe not on day one or week one or even year one, but given time, having someone to process your emotions with will help. Let's move on to tricks of the trade. So today for tricks of the trade, let's talk about how to make death meaningful in your games or how to learn something from them in your campaigns. And the first piece of advice I will give you is this: just let it have meaning. And by that, I mean you don't have to avoid character death. If the moment occurs where a character has legitimately hit their death threshold, they've lost enough hit points, their constitution has dropped, or whatever the condition may be that would cause a character to die, don't just change that or keep it from happening because you don't want to deal with a character death. If it makes sense for the narrative, use the death as an opportunity to add more emotion and meaning to your story. Embrace it. Don't throw it away. So another suggestion that I've had is you can plan a death as well. Now, This might be something that if you're going to do, you should probably discuss with the character ahead of time, the player ahead of time, saying, hey, I would like to use a moment in the story where your character might die or temporarily be away from the game. Or this could be a good place to use a profound NPC death that has been set up and arranged. If you do go with the permission of your player, then give them the opportunity to play a new character or something like that. But in order to do this, it does need to be properly communicated if it is something that is planned. You have to be able to ask them how they're feeling about their character. And when a player is not enjoying their character, this is honestly a good opportunity to have an emotional moment in game, have that character that they're not connecting with or not enjoying playing, still provide a meaningful piece of story, a piece of narrative to the game that you're playing, and sort of go by the wayside in terms of character death. Now, if you're looking for a way into a different character, or the build wasn't just for them, this is the great opportunity. And if you plan it together, it can be very emotional and very fulfilling as well to have that character still have a hero's journey style arc, make a big sacrifice, save the party in some way with a sacrifice of their lives. And those can add great narrative elements to your campaign. The beauty of this in that particular instance is that instead of having upset feelings towards having a player lose their life, that if they're no longer interested in it, you can instead make a memorable goodbye for the character. And you're providing that player the opportunity to do something that they're going to enjoy more than the character that they were previously playing. So it's sort of two birds with one stone, as it were. When you go through this process and you make the decision together, you have these moments where you can let the players have their characters, they have an opportunity to sort of have their last words or make their big show of sacrifice. And those can be very cinematic moments in a story. Now, my next piece of advice is something that you should not do when there's a character death in your game. You should never punish a player for their character having died. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means don't have a character sit around with nothing to do for a number of sessions if they have a character death. Find a way to keep them involved in the story, even if there's not an opportunity to introduce a new character, or they don't want to do that because they want to wait for the party to find a means of resurrection or something of that nature. Help them be involved in the story by allowing them to run monsters or play some of the enemies or run initiative or find things for them to do that will keep them involved in the story. Even perhaps give them the opportunity to engage in dream sequences or play out memories of the character's past with the other party members so that they still have elements of the story that they are contributing to as a player, even if they don't have a character that's being used at the time. You also don't want to brush over death. I've already said over and over on this episode that it should have meaning. It should be an opportunity for your players to grow and to experience deep emotions and learn something from the death. If there was a sacrifice, they should have the opportunity to appreciate the merits of that character's sacrifice. They can grow and learn from this. So don't just sweep death under the table. Don't forget about it. Let it have that moment of impact around your table. Take a moment of silence if you need to, and give some space before jumping into a new PC. Let the characters have that moment of experiencing a loss as a piece of their narrative. So when the new character finally does enter the game, they still had that feeling like they were missing something. It gives them the opportunity to fill a gap that was a void that was left in their hearts when their friend was taken from them. And a final don't I will give you is don't be afraid of characters dying in your stories. I've mentioned numerous reasons already why character death can be very good for narrative and it can be good for practicing real life. So don't avoid a scenario that might cause a character death. You still want your games to feel exciting and dangerous and have those moments where character death does take place, because that is sort of the idea of a fantasy adventure. Sometimes that happens. And these are fantasy worlds. There may be opportunities for these characters to come back in the future. I mean, think of how emotional it was when Gandalf fell in Moria to the Balrog. That was a moment of death, even though he came back later on. We still all got to have those moments of grief and of loss, and we got to experience that loss with the characters as we witnessed it taking place. Last thing I will say is that this is a collaborative storytelling game. And if you're a little too attached to the story that you're telling rather than the collaboration, you're not helping your players. If you're avoiding putting scenes in your game that could lead to character death, it's sort of like always making your players ride their bike with their training wheels. At some point, you do need to take those training wheels off and let them have the opportunities to make choices that could lead to a character death, especially when those opportunities are something they're making themselves. You want to give them the opportunity to act for themselves. And when those things happen, realize that this is the story that they are helping you tell. If they make a very poor decision, well, they're going to learn something from that as well. Either in character or out of character, they're going to learn. Very finally, I will say that just like they do in most movies and narratives that are well written, give a moment of hope afterwards. Even if this means where you have a cliffhanger where a character dies, the next session should begin with a moment to remember. If the death was so profound that everyone is still dealing with the loss, try and find a way very soon to work in a moment of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. And if it can't be for a while, take the opportunity and have a moment of hope out of character. Break the game for a moment. Break character for a few minutes. Have a few laughs. Tell a few jokes before you get back into the heaviness and the emotions and the seriousness. Just give your players the opportunity to have and experience some brevity after some heavy emotional experiences like that. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode. I hope you're enjoying the video format. If you have not yet followed or subscribed on YouTube, please do so. I would really love to make that following a great sized following so that hopefully we can find more ways to make this show last and push it forward into the future. As always, the little things that you can do, such as reviewing on Spotify, interacting with us on YouTube, leaving us good reviews on Apple Podcasts, and of course, anytime that you want to interact with me, you can find the Linktree link in our Instagram. That's Dungeons_Dragons_Psychology, and interact with us directly through email. So, that said, remember the value of character death. Don't be afraid of it in your stories. Use the tricks and the tips that I have given you here, and you will have way more emotional and immersive stories to tell around your table. Until next time, Cyclothids, we'll see you next session.